Discussing world-changing ideas through real conversations, exploring the potential of technology to solve the most critical challenges facing business, people, and the planet. Coming up.
If your power supply comes at a reasonable price, probably don't have to think too much about microgrids. If you are somewhere and you have to deal with outages, if your production is really affected, this would be then part of the business case, which could put you in a situation where it might make sense to think about microgrids.
This is the Real Conversations podcast by Nokia. Here is Michael Hainsworth.
Not every corporate campus, mining operation, or community needs a microgrid. So who needs a reliable, independent supply of electricity? And why is a renewable microgrid not always the go-to solution? Dr. Thomas Hillig advises companies on sustainability, renewables, and when a microgrid makes sense at THEnergy. And like many of the people we've spoken to, his past helps inform the future as he made the leap from the old world of big electricity into the 21st century.
I had a background in environmental services for conventional energy, for gas-fired power plants, for coal-fired power plants, filter equipment, and so on. After that, I already was in the renewable energy sector, but I was working in PV module sales, and I also was responsible for PV projects. Typical stuff somewhere in Europe or the US, free field installations. After that, I wanted to start something on my own, and I wanted to rely on stable framework conditions, so typically not on regularly changing policies. In standard renewables, basically you had a good year in Spain, after that a good year in the German market, after that a good year in Italy and the UK. But I decided to do something really strange, actually two pretty big contrasts. Renewables on the one hand side, but for the mining industry, for remote mining, where you have large amounts of energy consumption and actually microgrids, because you have to do the mining where the resources are and not where electricity is the cheapest.
A microgrid isn't just the same as a regular grid, only smaller. Explain the significance of a microgrid being an island.
Microgrids allow, under certain circumstances, for an islanded power generation. So in the end, you decouple from the national grid in a microgrid, or you are not connected at all. This is the second option. And then you generate electricity locally and consume it also locally. It does not have to be 100% of the time. A village could be connected to the national grid, but under certain circumstances. For example, if there are hurricanes, if there are certain wildfire conditions, it could make sense to decouple a certain section of the grid from the national grid, and this is what is a microgrid in the end.
We talk a lot about the issue in North America being that we have an aging infrastructure for electricity generation and transmission, and that this may be a solution as well. But to your point, you could have this in a faraway region that doesn't have access to transmission lines that exist. When we think of the technology that underpins a modern microgrid, I suppose we need to look at both the software and the hardware. What role does artificial intelligence and algorithms play in the software?
In the software side, you in the end want to match renewable energy or energy generation at all, or in total, with consumption. So demand and supply should be matched in an optimized way. And for this, in a typical microgrid, at least in the sophisticated ones, you have plenty of sensors, you have plenty of input data, and AI algorithms and machine learning actually help to optimize this matching of demand and supply.
Is this the kind of thing where you need to bring inside help for? It doesn't sound like you can just go to your local electronics store and buy an AI that helps you with a microgrid.
Yeah, actually, microgrid solutions are more something for communities. So if you have your own PV panel or array on the roof, you would not talk about a microgrid. So it is for villages, and it is indeed a little bit more sophisticated solution, absolutely.
What about the control technology? When it comes to the hardware, are we talking about IoT, the Internet of Things?
the Internet of Things can play an important role. There are different degrees of sophistication in microgrids. For example, at remote sites in Africa, where microgrids could bring power, electricity, for the first time to people that did not have access to power before. There, typically, you won't have microgrids that are so sophisticated. If we talk, what you mentioned before, about improving aging infrastructure in the US, this is absolutely an IoT topic.
IoT and 5G are very complementary technologies. What role does the wireless technology and the service provider for it play in a modern microgrid?
Microgrids are very much about collecting big tons of data. So one of the typical expressions is if you want to optimize a microgrid, you have to get through a whole lake of data. And to collect this data, some of this data is in stable environments, some is also moving. So some is very centralized directly at the grid. Sometimes you have to go a little bit beyond the borders of the microgrid. And in the end of connecting endless amounts of data and sensors to the central control unit, 5G is an ideal fit.
To your point, it's not just outfitting regions in Africa that don't have access to electricity right now, talking about communities, but also campuses. If I understand correctly, Siemens has a microgrid in Vienna.
Absolutely, yes. They have a microgrid in Vienna, and basically the capacity of their power connection was not big enough for the challenges of providing e-mobility solutions to their employees. So they decided to generate more electricity on site, actually, and to have a microgrid. But I have to admit, they have a little bit different definition of microgrid. 95%, I think, of the people were sticking to my definition. Here we have the definition that you have to control main parameters, main power parameters on site. And then in the end, they cannot run the microgrid in an islanded mode, but they could avoid to upgrade the grid connection by producing more electricity actually on site directly at the campus.
And when we expand out the idea of incorporating 5G and IoT down the road, I can imagine we think about smart cities and things of that nature. You've got electric cars that require electricity, and therefore knowing how much consumption they're taking in from the grid would be a critical component to feeding into that data lake, as you point out.
Absolutely. Microgrids and e-mobility, as mentioned also in Vienna. So there the approach actually is for employees if they charge during their working time, during daytime. But then driving patterns to have information which service technician typically goes how far, or what is the load level when he typically returns from his trip. What kind of car does he have? So all this information would be part of the data lake and would be used actually to optimize then the microgrid.
Well, that's interesting. So it's not just a far future kind of next generation microgrid in smart city type technology. It's something that we're using right now.
Absolutely.
You pointed out that there are quite a few views on just what a microgrid is. And I suppose there are expectations that it's all renewable energy.
Yeah. I think many people, if they refer to microgrids these days, it is a buzzword, think that it is the Swiss Army knife of the energy transition. Actually, if you really stick to the original definition, probably it is not that much a Swiss Army knife of the energy transition. Most of the microgrids that are out there are, in the end, small diesel gensets, also bigger diesel gensets. And as the name says, diesel gensets are not renewable, or at least 99% of the diesel that is used, apart from some biodiesel, maybe. But the challenge then is to decarbonize also these microgrids that are out there today, for example, in remote mining, or also neighborhood diesel gensets in remote Africa somewhere. So to make them actually more renewable, to run them on renewable energy, and to gradually replace then diesel consumption or heavy fuel oil consumption by renewable energy, such as solar and wind energy.
When it comes to renewable energy, though, what's the state of battery energy storage?
Yeah, battery energy storage is ideally fit, for example, if you have a solar array and if the solar array is shaded. And then if you have in the background also a conventional generator running, that you can switch off. The battery is a bridge to backup pretty often that allows for switching off the conventional generator during the day. And in the end, also, they are great to improve certain power parameters to make the energy generation more stable. Next step actually would be to rely on a different type of batteries, so-called long duration energy storage systems. Here, the focus would be then also to rely on renewable energy or on fluctuating energy sources during nighttime or during the whole night, and what is even more challenging during seasonal, if there are seasonal differences. For example, if you have 1 week without any sun or wind, that you can then also rely on renewables. There are flagship projects for that, but this is definitely not the state of the art today.
Do I understand this correctly, that the most known sort of battery energy storage technology right now for a microgrid is essentially the same technology as what we've got in our smartphones?
A little bit bigger, yes, but actually, yes, it's lithium-ion batteries. If we talk about long-duration energy storage, then names like redox flow would come into play. Also, hydrogen as an energy storage carrier.
How does hydrogen work? Because it was always my assumption that hydrogen was a power generation technology, not a power storage technology.
Typically, you convert wind energy and solar energy into hydrogen. Then you can store it, or you can use it also in industrial processes. For example, in the steel industry and the glass industry, you can use it for heating, but you can also reconvert it into electricity. So if you convert electricity, renewable energy, into hydrogen and reconvert it later into electricity, it is an energy storage medium.
Oh, that's fascinating, because, as I say, the assumption would be that you would create hydrogen, store it, and then use it to generate electricity. But how are you going to generate that hydrogen in the first place? You could use the renewable sources to pull the hydrogen out of, I guess, the air and out of systems, because it's one of the most prevalent elements in the universe.
Yeah, actually hydrogen, or if we talk about green hydrogen, it is generated mainly, or the main input is water. Mm-hmm. And then you need huge amounts of energy. And if we talk about green energy, it is then renewables. So wind and or solar energy to convert the water actually into hydrogen. There's also a natural hydrogen, but that is typically not really used for power generation.
Does the visibility of renewable help sell a microgrid?
Absolutely. I have a nice example. I talked to a safari lodge operator, and they said first they were trying to hide away their solar power plants. They had a microgrid, a remote microgrid at a safari lodge, and then they even did tours because they were seeing that people actually liked that the microgrid was powered by renewables, that the lodge was powered by renewables, and it was even a driver then for further microgrids at different safari lodges, and also not to hide them so much away. If we talk about communities, for example, in Europe or in the US, the situation is very similar. In Germany, there's a big not in my backyard issue, especially with wind power. But if people can invest into local power generation, and if they know that, for example, for the upcoming winter, the wind turbines that are just built next door would improve their power supply situation, so that they are in a better position when there is a power shortage, for example, in Germany. I think that definitely would help. The pure wind turbine itself, that there is a huge tower and a turbine turning, probably that does not help too much.
After this podcast, learn more about this and other insightful topics by going to nokia.com/thought-leadership. There you'll find additional information linked to today's podcast. I was fascinated by something you said right at the beginning of this conversation, and that is that most microgrids are not primarily powered by renewable today. It's a diesel gen set somewhere. What's the evolution of the microgrid look like if we're trying to get away from fossil fuels?
The low-hanging fruits, basically, and the best business case is just to replace a little bit of diesel by renewable energy, so without any energy storage. So you could inject or go up to 20% of renewable power, and that does not translate to 20% of diesel consumption or of diesel reduction. You would be much lower. So depending on the actual application, maybe 10%, maybe even only 5%. The next step would then be to come up with more sophisticated solutions where you have then advanced control systems. There you could go well beyond. Next step would be to add lithium-ion batteries, about which we talked before. And then the next step would be to go to long-duration energy storage systems. And the final stage is really to kick out all kind of backup gensets also. This could be if you have very seasonal applications, if you are in areas where you know that there's a high probability that you run without solar and wind energy. You have to deal with very low irradiations and hardly any wind speed over longer time periods. This is a challenge, and this would be then also very costly.
You mentioned the term business case. Let's sort of dig into that for a moment. As you point out, there are steps you can take to wean a microgrid off diesel genset systems. Why not just jump all in at the very beginning? How do you build that business case to take a microgrid from a diesel-based system to a 100% renewable system?
The different steps which I just explained are a little bit also associated to different cost levels. Mm-hmm. So the first step, just going in and replacing diesel gens or diesel by renewables, in the end, you could, let's assume you could do a 5 megawatt plant without any storage. Next step would be for the next 5 megawatt, you need another 5 megawatt of solar plus energy storage. So the investment cost for the same amount of renewable energy would then be considerably higher if you add storage. And then if you want to run fully without diesel, then you have to oversize, or you have to get, relatively speaking, more storage also into the microgrid. So this can be really a cost challenge. The last percentage, or the last 5 to 10%, they will be very costly. If you start from scratch, the situation is not so much different, because you have to rely, if you go renewable, in most of the places, on solar and on wind power. These two power sources are not stable. They are fluctuating. So you need something to balance. And then you need energy storage to balance, or you need a flexible energy source like diesel genset. It could be biodiesel in the end. But if you really want to scale up this whole development, there won't be enough biodiesel. There will be a shortage of biodiesel if you want to balance all microgrids with biodiesel.
And as you've pointed out, this isn't just about building a microgrid for a community. There are enterprises that have a need for a microgrid. It could be a remote mining operation, but maybe it's an automotive factory campus. Maybe it's a university campus. How do you make the business case to pull a large enterprise off a national grid and build a microgrid instead? Is it a financial business case, or is it more about reducing carbon footprint and the acknowledgement by industry that they need to do that? How do you make the business case?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the main component of the business case is resilience. If you need better power quality than you are getting, or than you think you will be getting in the future from the grid. For example, if we talk about hospitals, they already have backup diesel gensets today. If they think, for example, in the US, that there's a higher risk that they have to run large amounts of time on these diesel backup gensets, it could make sense to come up with more local, decentralized renewables in the end. And just putting more renewables at a certain place does not mean that you can really run a certain site fully on these renewables. It is also the aspect of having a grid forming element. So normally these are conventional power plants. These are large coal-fired power plants. These are gas-fired power plants. They form the grid, and then you add some renewables. If you go into this islanded mode, something else has to form the grid. And this could be diesel gensets or energy storage. But then you are in a completely different situation. And I have not really fully answered your question.
Well, it's an incredibly complex question.
It is a complex question. So for university campuses, just as a background information, I think it is just they want to demonstrate what is technically feasible. Probably you don't have even a business case. It's playing around a little bit, and there are not too many enterprises who fully go off the grid. I don't know any big factory that was on the grid before, so that you just take off fully off the grid.
So then let me wrap up our time together by asking you this question. What is the most important advice you provide to a client interested in building a microgrid?
I think it's very important to know which problems the microgrid should solve. If it is just about getting cheap electricity, probably the microgrid is not the easiest solution you have at hand. You could also source electricity through corporate power purchase agreements. If you need power of a higher quality than you're getting from the grid, then in most of the situations, it's very difficult for you to actually convert the power grid. Then you might have to do something locally. But be aware, why do you need a microgrid? What are your problems? If you don't have any problem at all today, if you can, for example, source clean energy at acceptable conditions, if your power supply comes at a reasonable price, probably don't have to think too much about microgrids. If you are somewhere and you have to deal with outages, if your production is really affected, this would be then part of the business case, which could put you in a situation where it might make sense to think about microgrids.
Building a future that's productive, sustainable, and inclusive in a world that acts together. Discover how by visiting nokia.com/thought-leadership.